This week we have a couple developments on the military side of things. So we thought we'd get John Ridgen here and also Colby, which is great, to discuss mainly the two announcements this week. One, GLSDB, which is a weapon John will explain in a moment. And there's also a mention of two air defense systems that were sent to Ukraine, which should greatly enhance their capability there. So John, I'll turn it over to you. You can let the audience know whatever you want about this stuff.
Right, so I suppose we should start with the announcement concerning GLSDB, Ground Launched Small Diameter Bomb. So for those who aren't familiar, a couple days ago, I believe it was on either Wednesday or Thursday, the press, I think it was it Politico? I think it had announced. Okay, Politico. They had announced that per their sources in the DoD that the DoD had taken delivery of the first production lot of GLSDB rounds produced by Boeing and Saab and had completed their test shot campaign to verify or validate the performance of the first serial production missiles, and that first lot, sans those expended in testing at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, would be delivered to Ukraine within the next 24 to 48 hours. That was then later confirmed on the record, I believe, by Victoria Nuland of the State Department while she was visiting Kyiv, I believe, the next day on Thursday or Friday. As far as I'm aware, we don't actually know for certain if the ZSU has taken delivery of those systems yet. We haven't seen any indication that they've been employed in combat yet, but they should be taking delivery of them in the very immediate future if they haven't already. Colby will know, but there was some additional reporting on the quantities that followed that initial report that indicated the first lot would consist of, quote, several dozen missiles. I'm interpreting that as somewhere in the range of probably 24 to 48 rounds, and I believe half a dozen launchers. So for those who are, again, not familiar, GLSDB is advertised as being compatible with M142 HIMARS and M270 MLRS, both of which Ukraine already has in service in a couple different variants from a few different donors. GLSDB uses the same launch pod container as M26 MLRS and M30, M31 Gimlers. However, the integration hadn't been done previously, as no other HIMARS or MLRS operator had decided to adopt GLSDB. Nobody else had really shown any commercial interest in it. Ukraine's really the first because of this unique set of circumstances, and it was something that could be made available to them relatively quickly and inexpensively. So Boeing and Saab were offering a proprietary launcher in two variations. The first was a sort of containerized launcher that you would mount on the back of a truck. I believe we have a picture of that or a couple images of that we can put up for those of y'all. And then there was another version that was more or less sort of a trailer assembly that you could load onto the back of the truck and then release onto the ground. It isn't clear which of those Ukraine would be getting. Obviously, both have demonstrated hardware. The containerized launcher system that was used for the test shots of the initial prototype rounds that was done in Norway as part of their initial test campaign, better part of, I think, a decade ago now. So presumably at some point it will be made compatible with HIMARS and MLRS, but the initial indication is that at the beginning they're going to be using this proprietary launcher system. I had a conversation with Jakub, originally from Oryx's team, about this in January of last year. This is all public replies on Twitter if anybody wants to go track this down in my timeline history. He had mentioned that per his contacts at the DoD, the software baseline for HIMARS and MLRS, which is controlled by the DoD, the software baseline integrating GLSDB in both of those platforms was in principle completed. However, it was pending certification. My working assumption prior to this announcement is that that certification process would have been completed and that integration as a whole would have been completed by the time of delivery, given that it was about 9 months, and one would think that would be about long enough to complete that certification program and then do those test shots if needed with the missiles from that first serial production lot, but that doesn't seem to be the case yet. So presumably full integration with HIMARS MLRS is somewhere further out on the timeline. And in terms of just GLSDB itself, what it brings to the table, what it essentially is, it's a GBU-39 SDB small diameter bomb that has been adapted and mounted onto a solid rocket motor taken from a old decommissioned M26 MLRS rocket. For those again who aren't familiar, M26 MLRS was the first series of munitions introduced with M270 MLRS when it was first fielded in U.S. Army service. About 20 to 40 kilometer range, depending on the version, dispensed a bunch of DPICM submunitions. The U.S. Army and Marines fielded about 300 something thousand rounds over the course of its service, or over the course of its time in U.S. service. Most, if not all of those, have since been withdrawn. At least 100,000 of those rounds have been demilitarized and disposed of. So we should have a couple 100,000 of these motors in various different states in storage. The commercial pitch for GLSDB was that it was a low-cost commercial off-the-shelf option because it could leverage an existing payload, GLSDB, an existing motor, the M26 motor, and then Saab would produce a proprietary adapter to mount them together, and then just use standard M26 pods, launch pod containers, and go from there. For a variety of reasons, again, nobody really had any commercial interest in it. The main selling point over Gimler's, aside from just the cost of it, was that it had a 150 kilometer range, whereas Gimler's has roughly an 80 kilometer range. So this will, even though it's going to be in fairly limited quantity, this should expand Ukraine's ability to prosecute and hold certain targets at risk at this greater range bracket. So whereas previously, if they wanted to reach something beyond 80 kilometers, they either had to jig up something with a UAV, use a limited number of Tochnyi, or use Storm Shadow or Scout BG. Now they will have a more sustainable way to hold targets at risk in that 80 to 150 kilometer range band. Again, obviously scale is a concern here. They're only getting a couple dozen in the first production lot. We don't know at what rate Boeing and Saab can produce these. We don't know what rate they're trying to facilitize to. We don't know how many were contracted with the original contract placed by the DoD, which had a total valuation of, I believe, $33 million. And there's also the practical issue of the United States, the White House is out of funding mechanisms to continue to procure GLSDB for Ukraine beyond the production lots that we initially contracted, because USAI was exhausted several months ago. So until the Supplemental Appropriations Act is passed by Congress, the United States cannot actually procure any additional GLSDB rounds, again, beyond what was already slated to be delivered per the original contract. So sustainment here is going to be a concern, again, until that supplemental gets enacted, or unless another ally or partner, say in Europe, maybe Sweden themselves, for example, steps in and places orders with Boeing and Saab to keep those deliveries going in the interim, and to potentially supplement future additional U.S. orders.
Colby, do you have anything you want to add about GLSDB, or you think John covered it pretty thoroughly?
No, John didn't leave me much to explain. That was fairly comprehensive. Maybe the only one thing that I would add emphasis for is that even though Reuters, the article that they wrote following Politico's break of the story, even though Reuters' article didn't explicitly say this, I did confirm with them that these are in fact proprietary launchers from Boeing that are being shipped, because I'm sure some people are going to make the assumption that Ukraine is getting more HIMARS from the United States, and that is not true, at least not in this shipment. These are some number of proprietary launchers that are being provided from Boeing following the testing at Elgin. So that is something that Reuters was able to confirm with the Department of Defense.
Thanks, Colby. So, John, I guess like my question, maybe to help the audience a bit, and then we'll get to some audience questions. Like, if we think about like Ukraine's current capabilities in terms of striking targets, they have HIMARS, right? They have GIMLRs. They don't have these new GIMLRs, but they have the old weapon. So, like comparing the two, like what types, like will GLSDB be used similar to GIMLRs, or where does that comparison start and stop, right?
Right. So just for context, for people, the new GIMLRs that Joseph is referring to is GIMLRs, which is as the name suggests, extended range GIMLRs that will be entering U.S. Army service in the near future. The first production lot of that was originally scheduled to be cut into production in 2024, cut into the existing GIMLRs production line in fiscal year 2024. Unfortunately, because we are under a continuing resolution and we are the better part of 5 months in the fiscal year, that contract has not been awarded because the funds that were slated to be appropriated for these contracts and all other 2024 fiscal year 2024 procurement and R&D have not occurred. But again, that was for the first. Setting that aside, those, I believe the initial order was for about 120 of those. That was supposed to again enter production this fiscal year, which hasn't happened yet because of this budgetary faff. But the principal aspect of GIMLRs was that the U.S. Army had a range requirement of 150 kilometers, so almost double the existing or the range of existing GIMLRs, which is again 80 kilometers or so. I believe I can't remember off the top of my head if GLSDB was explicitly offered for that competition, but in any case, the Army selected GIMLRs for a variety of reasons. GIMLRs is just honestly, in all respects except cost and time to set up the production line, GIMLRs is the superior product, which is partially why Ukraine got saddled with GLSDB, because it was something that we could do quickly and at a somewhat notable scale, I would say. Again, given the constraints on time and funding here. But going back to the comparison with just existing M30, M31 GIMLRs, you would expect an effects profile very similar to M31 GIMLRs. They both have similarly sized warheads. Obviously, there's going to be some differences there, explosive filler, exact explosive filler mass, etc. But broadly speaking, similar warhead sizes, you're going to expect similar effects on target. I believe GLSDB, well, SDB as just a payload, should have a somewhat better semi-armor penetrating capability than GIMLRs, just by the nature of its design. So it could be useful for some more hardened targets than GIMLRs would ordinarily be used for. In terms of what Ukraine will actually be using it for, I mean, given that they don't have any other assets besides Storm Shadow and Scalp EG to prosecute targets beyond 80 kilometers, I suspect it's just going to be whatever relevant high value targets they are able to locate within that 80 to 150 kilometer range band. That's what they're going to use these for. Whatever high value targets they can locate as dictated by the availability of the missiles.
Yeah, thanks, John. So I think you mentioned this, but it seems like the targets that Ukraine would choose, because we have a question from Valentin Ivanov. What targets do we expect GLSDBs to be employed against? I assume similar stuff to GIMLRs, right? Like troop concentration, a little bit more range, though, maybe? Go ahead.
Yeah, again, so it's almost double the range of GIMLRs. What I would say is that I wouldn't say it's the same type of targets as GIMLRs, because the type of assets that Russia is going to have deployed, 80 to 100 kilometers, 80 to 150 kilometers from the front line are not the same assets they're going to have deployed between 0 and 80 kilometers from the front line. So, the type of tactical usage that we see with GIMLRs, we may not see with GLSDB, just because of the nature of the assets that Russia has deployed at those distances from the front line. So I would expect things like, for example, C2 nodes. If there's ammunition fuel depots, prosecute those.
Ireland is aggressively zooming in on an air base right now.
Yes. They could do some fun stuff at Zhangkoi and northern Crimea if they wanted. They could potentially use it on FARPs, the forward arming refueling points for Russian rotary wing assets like the Ka-52s, the Mi-28 Havocs, the Hinds as well, the Mi-24s. Those would also be, targets that they could now be able to service more effectively that they previously couldn't. So this will open up some options for them. Obviously, again, the overall impact, this will be strongly contingent on how many they get, which is currently limited by various other financial considerations, really, from the U.S. perspective.
Thanks, John. Colby, do you have anything you want to add about any of this?
Not on GLSDB, but maybe just on the ER Gimlers. Whenever that production cut-in does happen, theoretically, Ukraine may receive those as well. We don't know, but it's possible that the Department of Defense has already made a commitment for ER Gimlers in past USAI packages for Ukraine, but we just don't know whether that's happened or not. So that could be something that's in the pipeline. But as John said, that has not happened yet. The production hasn't started. There's no contract for it yet, as far as we're aware. But that's something that may make an appearance as well at some point in time in the future.
Yeah, I was also going to add that it's also possible, for example, ER Gimlers already has a number of foreign operators that have placed contracts for it. Most notably, Poland has bought an enormous number of them, along with just regular Gimlers. So it's always possible, for example, that once Poland takes delivery of some quantity of their order for them, that they could do a third-party transfer request and transfer some to Ukraine if they felt so inclined, and the State Department and the DoD felt so inclined. So things like that are also possible. Obviously, just pure speculation, but at this point, but it's not inconceivable that Ukraine could end up operating ER Gimlers at some point. Sort of from an industrial policy standpoint here, we were always sort of faced with the dilemma that, again, there is this time and this budget crunch that we have to work under. The ideal approach, I suspect, would have been to just not procure GLSDB and instead accelerate the cut-in of ER Gimlers. That would have been more expensive, though, both in terms of getting that manufacturing capacity tooled up, as well as the individual rounds themselves. The first lot of ER Gimlers, and obviously, again, this is the very first lot. AUR, all up round costs, so the individual unit cost of them will decrease as it enters larger scale production. But the initial unit cost of ER Gimlers is about $450,000 a round. GLSDB, we don't have any specific numbers because none of this has been disclosed. My rough estimate is that it's probably in line with Gimler's 150,000, just by virtue of the fact that it's not that expensive to recapitalize, refurbish, and recertify those motors. A GBU 39 SDB itself is only about $35,000 per unit if bought in bulk. The adapter only costs so much, and then obviously you have the cost of final assembly, integration, loading into the launch pod container, etc. So again, if we just had a lot of money and where we were taking a really long-term view here, it would have been probably a smarter decision to just cut in ER Gimlers immediately and begin rapidly converting the Gimlers line to ER Gimlers as quickly as we reasonably could. But again, because of these overarching budget constraints that are a result of ultimately political constraints, GLSDB was the right option at the time that this contract was placed with the available appropriations in terms of USAI.
Yeah, we also have a couple more questions. One from B. Goldhagen. How are targets acquired?
Same process as Gimlers or any other U.S. provided PGM that uses inertial and GPS navigation.
Could you explain?
Precision guided missile. We'll start there, John.
Precision guided munition. Well, I mean, I think the question's, I guess, not a good approach to it, in the sense that how they're going to find targets it's going to be the same intelligence and targeting cycle they're already using. They're already going to have an existing process that they use to develop the location of enemy assets, personnel, capabilities, systems, and stuff.
The guys that launch it get a set of coordinates, right, John? They don't
Yes.
really know how it was
Oh,
done.
yeah. So, yeah. I guess that's a better way to frame it. The guys that are launching it don't. I don't want to say this definitively for rocket artillery. It's certainly true for tube artillery. The guys operating the system that are firing the gun or launching the missiles usually have no idea what they're firing at. They're given a set of coordinates by, in the case of tube artillery, it's a fire direction center, at least in sort of the U.S. Army, the NATO approach to it. Ukrainians may approach it somewhat differently, but they're just given a set of coordinates to engage with something like ATACMS or GLSDB, since there's some maneuvering involved. In addition to the set of coordinates, there'll be like an actual there'll be a mission planning process that a centralized mission planning cell does. That targeting data will then just be transmitted to the launcher, and the unit will just act upon that. So it just the targeting is just done as part of their normal ISTAR cycle: intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's just going to be some guy on Telegram from Omsk, just posting a picture of him smiling in front of his a Ukrainian building in occupied territory that's become their HQ, and they get the coordinates for that and they launch. Or sometimes they get human intelligence. There's lots of ways they get coordinates, but then once they have the coordinates, the systems are relatively agnostic, unless, as John said, there's some kind of precision guidance required to get it there.
Well, it's not just precision guidance. So anything that you need route planning for. So one of the whole things with GLSDB is that it's advertised, like, for example, you can engage targets that are on the reverse slope of an incline, so a mountain or a large hill or a ridge line or something. You can route, because GLSDB is a glide bomb, you can route it around stuff. So beyond just putting in the coordinates into the weapon. So with Gimlers, it's a pretty simple matter of you put the coordinates in and it navigates on a quasi-ballistic trajectory to that set of coordinates, more or less. For ATACMS, it's a little bit more complicated because ATACMS is an aeroballistic missile, much more so than Gimlers, and it can maneuver significantly in azimuth. So, for example, you can have the launcher not in line with the target, have the missile fly out 30 degrees, more or less on a trajectory to fly past the target, and then suddenly have the missile just jank left or right towards the target to impact it right in terminal. You can do stuff like that. So the programming for it's a little bit more sophisticated. Something like GLSDB, if you want to make full use of its capabilities, you would need to do some of that route planning if you wanted to route it, say, around a mountain or a hill to hit something on the back of an incline, things like that. Now, given the terrain in Ukraine, I'm not sure the Ukrainians are actually going to get much use out of some of those capabilities. What I would suspect is that my general assumption going into this is that I would expect GLSDB to be somewhat less survivable against Russian integrated air and missile defenses than Gimlers, mainly because, again, it's a subsonic aerodynamic gliding threat. Not saying it's trivial for the Russians to shoot it down. It's smaller than Gimlers. It's going to be, a little bit harder to detect it. But from a kinematic standpoint of setting up an engagement, it should be a bit easier to defeat with, say, Tor, Buk, Pantsir, compared to Gimlers. So they may want to try and do some routing around, known Russian air defense sites, or, for example, if they're concerned with the fidelity of their guidance solution, they may want to route it around known Russian threat emitters, EW assets that could be performing GPS denial, etc. So they may, again, the mission planning process might be a little bit more sophisticated for GLSDB, depending on how the Ukrainians choose to employ it. But they're just going to leverage their existing targeting cycle to generate, these coordinates for these targets.
Yeah, thank you, John. We also have another question from a viewer from Nectorn. Any chance they will use GLSDB against Konhar or Chonhar bridge, or is the word too small to be worth the use?
So people have been talking about GLSDB or just SDB just in general and bridges, the thing to remember about it is that it has a similar warhead size to Gimler's. So what I'd say is it's very effective against targets that are under bridges. I'm not sure how effective it would be against a bridge in and of itself. There's actually a very, I don't have the GIF on me, unfortunately, but there's a very, very classic video of a GLSDB penetrating, and this was a live fire test, penetrating through a arch bridge and then detonating after it had passed through and destroying an aircraft that was hidden under that arch bridge. So if the Russians have decided to hide stuff under the Chonhar Bridge, this is definitely be a use case for it. But in terms of something like, destroying the bridge itself, this is not really the ideal weaponeering approach. I suppose, kind of like Gimler's and the Antonovsky Bridge, if you have enough of them and you put enough of them through the bridge in enough places, you'll probably put it out of commission. But again, that's not really an ideal or efficient weaponeering approach, really, and not something they'll be able to do with GLSDB, just given the limited quantity in which they'll be receiving them.
Yeah, I mean, there were several attempts to take out this bridge in the past as well, and this was one of the pictures that we got from the Russians. So nice damage assessment for free. But yeah, it seems like this is a pretty well reinforced bridge.
John, I have a question. I've gotten this from a lot of different people, and it doesn't just apply to GLSDB, but all of Ukraine's GPS-guided munitions that they've been using. A lot of people seem to think that Russian EW has gotten so powerful and so effective that GPS-guided munitions just aren't being useful for Ukraine anymore. And I know that's really not true. I mean, Russian EW is definitely something that is not it is capable and it's a factor in the battlefield, but I don't think it's on the level that any of the GPS-guided munitions Ukraine has, whether it's Gimler's or Storm Shadow or soon ground-launched small diameter bomb, are just useless. But a lot of people coming into my reply seem to have that assumption for some reason. So maybe you can talk about the state of Russian EW and GPS denial.
Yeah, so we know we know with reasonable confidence, based upon some publications that Russia has released, derived from interviews with Ukrainian personnel, that Russian EW is a factor, and there's been other sources that have been, I guess, disclosed less than legally, shall we say, that also reference this. Russian EW is clearly a factor in their mission planning process for both Gimler's, for Jade MER, presumably for GLSDB as well. It certainly has an impact. I would say there are definitely numerous cases of Gimler's Jade MER being defeated by Russian EW, and by defeated I mean that it means their impact point is far enough from their desired aim point as a virtue, but by the result of their GPS being denied, that it doesn't have the desired effect on target. I mean, that's certainly something that has occurred. My understanding is that it has affected JDAM ER more than Gimler's. I have a couple theories as to why. It's also been affecting Excalibur to some extent. But it's not like 100% of these PGMs are being defeated. In the case of JDAM ER, what we had found out was that rather than having to allocate one munition per aim point, they were having to allocate 2 to 3, and that would produce the desired effect on target. So again, it's very much situational. In general, Ukraine, if they have the ability to do so, Ukraine will try to neutralize EW assets that are defending a given target before using PGMs, if they can. So again, it's a very situational factor, I would say. It's a consideration, but it doesn't deny Ukraine the ability to effectively use their PGMs, like not even remotely close to that. It's the same thing as, the Russians are able to intercept some portion of Gimler's with their air defense capabilities, with Buk, with Tor, primarily. Different numbers have been thrown around. I know Rusi said like 50%. My understanding is that that's a kind of a gross exaggeration. The real number's like closer to around 20-25%. But again, that just means that for some fire missions, they allocate 2 Gimlers to an aim point instead of 1. It doesn't, render these capabilities ineffective. It just it shapes the mission planning profile and the conditions under which they're used.
So, John, do we have any concluding thoughts on the GLSDB stuff before we move on to the next topic?
I don't believe so.
Colby, anything you wanted to add about GLSDB before we move to the next?
Just that with any munition, the key is always quantity here. This is a persistent problem for Ukraine. Obviously, 155, there's a severe shortage of ammunition relative to requirement. So the impact of GLSDB or anything else is just really going to depend on how many can be provided to Ukraine and on what timeline. Sounds like it's a small quantity to start, and hopefully that is able to ramp up to some degree. And the initial contract covered an amount that could potentially have some wider impacts, but there's definitely going to need to be further commitments and contracting options term to ensure that they have a sustained supply of these so that they can continue to use them and get some sort of wider impacts on the battlefield from them.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as far as we know right now, we're talking about a couple dozen, but we need probably a couple hundred, ideally a couple thousand. Would that be accurate, Colby?
Yeah, most definitely.
Great. Okay, so the next topic is there was an announcement recently that two very capable air defense systems were headed to Ukraine. So, John, I'll let you kind of cover the details of that. Go ahead.
Right. So the other day, President Zelensky had announced that Ukraine had received 2 additional air defense systems from partners that had the capability to intercept, quote, everything. And there's been a lot of he didn't specifically name the systems or who they were provided by, and so there's been some rather rampant speculation over what these assets are. There's a couple ways to look at this. I've sat down and thought about it, looked through some data and some public sourcing, and I have a couple of theories on what the most likely explanations are. So there's 2 ways to look at this. The first is to take him literally and assume that intercept everything refers to full spectrum aerodynamic and ballistic defeat capability. So systems that can defeat both ballistic and aerodynamic threats. Of those, there are only 2 systems that Ukraine has received from allies partners, and only 2 systems 2 Western systems that they can receive that have those capabilities, and that is Patriot and SAMP-T. A lot of people have been assuming that it's SAMP-T. I would caution people against making that assumption. Thus far, I have not seen any indication from any source, any reporting whatsoever, indicating or pointing to that Ukraine is slated to receive any additional SAMP-T batteries from either France or Italy. Obviously, again, the fact silence doesn't necessarily mean anything. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But on the other hand, there was reporting in August of 2023, the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States had made a statement that they were purchasing Patriot batteries for themselves from Raytheon, in addition to NASAMS and a few other systems. The NASAMS purchase occurred. There was a Defense Security Cooperation Agency announcement of the approval of a foreign military sale of NASAMS to the government of Ukraine, and there was a associated congressional notification of sale for it. However, there was never a DISCA announcement or a congressional notification of sale, either for a foreign military sale or a direct commercial sale for any number of Patriot batteries to Ukraine. My gut instinct, kind of reading between the lines here, is I would suspect, given there's no specific indication that it would be SAMP-T, none were expected to be, no additional systems are currently or publicly known to be expected to be provided by either France or Italy. My instinct would be, again, if Zelensky was being literal here, and this is a system that can defeat both aerodynamic and ballistic threats, that this could be the Patriot battery, the new build Patriot batteries that, per the Ukrainian ambassador, that they had ordered sometime last year. I would expect that's the most likely, most plausible explanation at this time. If we kind of look back, if we kind of take a step back, though, the other perspective is to just not take him literally, and that brings two other systems into the equation: IRIS-T SLM and NASAMS, both of which can only engage aerodynamic threats. In terms of IRIS-T SLM, there is a backlog of those systems for Ukraine, or that are on order for Ukraine. However, the German government, as German aid to Ukraine can testify here, they're usually pretty transparent about indicating beforehand sort of roughly when these systems will be delivered, or have been delivered. There hasn't been any indication that, you know, two IRIS-T SLM batteries are slated to be delivered in the immediate future, although again there is that pending order backlog, or that they have been delivered. So I'm just enormously skeptical it's IRIS-T SLM based upon that, because again, based on all the prior IRIS-T SLM deliveries, we've had some sort of, you know, indication immediately before from the German government, or from the German government immediately after the delivery was made, that those systems have been delivered. The other option is, of course, NASAMS. There's a massive backlog of those systems for Ukraine. There were, 14 complete batteries that have been ordered for them, and of those, I think either 3 or 4 have been delivered. So there's still a very large potential backlog, with a skeleton of at least 8 additional batteries delivered by Norway themselves. So it could just be 2 more NASAMS batteries. I would say, again, if Zelensky wasn't being literal, if that's the interpretation we choose to go with, I'd say maybe NASAMS is a bit more likely. But again, if we do take them literally, I suspect it's probably those Patriot systems that they had reportedly purchased. And in terms of there not being any sort of public notification, either from the Defense Security Cooperation Agency or a congressional notification of sale, my instinct would be that that would be an indicator that this was executed as a classified foreign military sale, which would not require public notification, either via DISCA or via just, you know, in the congressional record as a congressional notification that would be notified in a classified setting to the relevant members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So that would never enter into the public record unless really the customer chose to disclose it, the Ukrainian government, or the U.S. leaked it or something.
I have a question for both you and Colby, and it's a little bit general. When it comes to munitions for, let's say, air defense systems or GLSDB, Gimlers, we now have these funds coming in from Europe. Would it be possible that Ukraine bought directly, or does it need to be going through a lot of red tape and approvals?
Could you say that again, Erland?
So if Ukraine would want to acquire munitions for instance, Gimlers, GLSDB, would it require a lot of red tape and bureaucracy and approvals for that to happen directly from the US?
Red tape and bureaucracy is the watchword of the United States foreign military sale and direct commercial sale process, my friend.
Yeah, okay. But has any of those processes been already like passed because they have been receiving certain weapons?
Yes. So as I said, Ukraine got approval for a foreign military sale of the NASAMS battery. We don't actually know if that contract was signed. I think Jeff had actually mentioned that in the chat last stream when I had talked about this. They got approval for it. Nobody ever stated if they signed the contract. That's something I need to follow up on privately with a couple people. So we don't have clarity on that publicly, but they have gotten FMS approval for that. The other thing to consider is that there is, in terms of what gets notified, either publicly via DSCA or as a congressional notification, again to the House Foreign Affairs Committee or the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that's dependent on a couple things. There is a value threshold. So if the total valuation of the sale, be it for FMS or DCS, is below a certain dollar amount, DSCA is not required to issue a public notification, and those two committees are not required to receive notifications either. And also, if it's not what's considered a major defense article, and it's again below that dollar limit. If it meets both those criteria, then there isn't a public notification process. So it's possible Ukraine could have been buying like $50 million of like lubricants, $50 million in spare parts. They could be making a bunch of small purchases for like various sustainment assets, and some sustainment support stuff, either again as an FMS action or a DCS action. And that would likely never be publicly notified because they wouldn't meet the threshold for public notification, again, either via the DSCA or in the congressional record.
I will add that a huge number of sales, both FMS and DCS, are processed that are below the notification threshold. So we never find out about any of this because it doesn't have to be told to Congress, it doesn't have to be made public. There's no record outside of the executive branch in their own internal records. So we just don't know who's buying what if it's below those thresholds. So Ukraine could conceivably be buying a lot. This is, kind of a way, I guess you could say, in the system by splitting.
Colby, your audio is really bad.
I think my internet's really weak.
Yeah, you've gone full Dalek on us.
Okay. I don't know if you can get better connection, Colby. Well, he left. Maybe he'll come back. You also sent me an article, John, before we went online. Do you want me to display that?
Sure, go ahead.
So this is pretty interesting.
Yes, so that's the article in Ukrainian media from August of last year in which the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States had referenced that they were purchasing various defense articles from the United States, NASAMS, ammunition, and Patriot. So if you scroll down, the context of this was the part of their push to get Lend-Lease reenacted as it expired at the end of fiscal year 2023. That was obviously not successful, but as part of this, I guess she casually slipped in that, we have purchased Patriot, which nobody. It's unfortunate that I believe one Alex Rafoglu of the White House press corps, he followed up on it, and the DoD refused to comment. But unfortunately, no other journalist has bothered to follow this up with either Raytheon, the DoD, or State Department, or the Ukrainian government, unfortunately.
Colby, are you with us again?
Mic check.
You're all good, man.
Okay, hopefully that holds. So notification thresholds, there's a huge amount of sales that are going through below those thresholds, so we don't know what's getting sold to who. It's kind of a way to game the system, splitting up your purchases into smaller amounts so that Congress doesn't have to be notified. Although that doesn't, in some cases, for some customers, that's more important. Saudi Arabia does this a lot, and they kind of need to.
Colby,
because
your audio's going again.
Rip Colby.
Just to sort of, I guess, round that out while he works on his audio and his internet. It's just sort of the nature of the foreign military sale and the DCS process. Most countries, when they're placing these sales, not everybody is buying these big new weapon systems in quantity all the time. Just sort of by the very nature of how armed forces military operations works, most of this stuff is going to be mainly stuff to support, training, operational support, and sustainment support. It's going to be spare parts. It's going to be lubricant. It's going to be all these other little things that you need to make these systems work, to operate them successfully in the field. And, that stuff, in aggregate, it's expensive, obviously. There's a reason why almost about like a third of the DoD budget, more than the GDP of some countries, goes to operations and maintenance. But the individual little components of this are small, so it adds up, obviously. But lubricant doesn't cost that much. A lot of these spare parts don't cost that much, so you end up with just for countries that are, just getting all these things that they need for sustainment, it just ends up being a bunch of really small purchases that all fall below the relevant notification thresholds.
John, do you want to get into your missile theory at all, or is that something you're still working on?
Come again?
Do you want to get into your Patriot missile theory based on?
Oh, right. Oh, yes. This is actually really interesting. So, obviously, the IL-76 that was shot down, presumably over Belgorod, a lot of claims circulated about that. Some very dubious claims were circulated by the Russians. But one aspect of it, besides the whole POW thing, was that the Russians claimed the Ukrainians shot it down, obviously. Well, the Russians released images of purported missile wreckage recovered in Belgorod. And what's particularly interesting is that that's Patriot wreckage. That is undeniably wreckage from a missile fired by Patriot. The color scheme's correct. The dimensions are all correct. The markings are all perfectly consistent with what you would expect from Patriot. Obviously, setting aside sort of, I know people raised the question of, oh, well, they could have planted it there, blah 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 blah. That's a little bit aside from the point that I'm trying to get at here. What is uniquely interesting is that that wreckage looks broadly consistent with a PAC-2, which we know Ukraine has received. PAC-2 GMT, same family of large diameter missiles, about 160 kilometer range. The U.S. has a lot of them in inventory. We've been providing them to the Ukrainians. And that's sort of one, aside from PAC-3, both CRI and MSE for ballistic missile defense. PAC-2 MSE is, or excuse me, PAC-2 MSE, what am I talking about? PAC-2 and GMT are sort of the standard for long range aerodynamic threat defeat capability. What was interesting, though, was the Russians published what they claimed was text recovered, like serial numbers and production dates recovered from the wreckage, but they didn't actually post the pictures of the wreckage that they claimed that had been recovered from, just what was written on it. And the serial number and the manufacturing date was 1983. PAC-2 didn't enter U.S. service until 1990, and PAC-1 didn't enter U.S. service until after 83, I believe. So I went through some of the serial numbers and such. If that manufacturing date and some of the other numbers that they had released are accurate, again, it's a question mark since they didn't actually release images of the wreckage that they claim to have, that stuff was claimed to be written on. It looks like this is the wreckage of an MIM-104A, also known as Standard, which is the original missile that Patriot shipped with in the 80s when it was first fielded in U.S. Army service. And this is rather shocking to me because I discussed this at some length many months ago last year when Patriot was first delivered concerning stockpiles of PAC-1 and Standard. Myself and those that I consulted with, we were all under the impression that all the PAC-1 stocks had been demilitarized and disposed of, as had Standard. That it appears that is not the case, and that we have somehow or another provided those ancient missiles to Ukraine, in addition to obviously PAC-2 GMT and PAC-3 CRI and PAC-3 MSE, all of which were previously known. So this is a rather interesting development. Again, sort of skirting around the question. Again, people are going to bring up, was it planted or not? Doesn't really matter to this. They obviously got the wreckage from somewhere, and I think it's unlikely that this is wreckage they recovered from like the 90s or the 80s that they just have had in storage for 40 years, just waiting to bust this out to stage a propaganda shoot. I would suspect they almost certainly recovered this wreckage following a Patriot engagement in Ukraine. Whether or not it was in Belgorod with the IL-76, that doesn't really matter to me, to be honest, for this. Just outside this. But in any case, it's a very strong indicator that we do actually have stocks of these older missiles and that we have provided them to Ukraine. This is rather beneficial because of their age. They've depreciated enormously in value. I can't put a specific quantitative figure to it because these munitions all depreciate according to different rates, and that's not really public information. There's You have to have access to some very, very deep DoD financial information to be able to actually compute the figures quantitatively, but they're going to have a depreciated value of near zero. The net book value for the purposes of presidential drawdown authority, as well as the basic valuation in general, it's just going to be near zero. And so what this opens up is the possibility that because they are excess to our requirements, unlike PAC-2, which is older, we have a very large quantity of, I believe, prior to the invasion, we had about 6,000 inventory, so very considerable stocks. They were not excess to requirements. We still had them. We were still operationally fielding them with Patriot units, and we continue to do so to this day. PAC-1 and Standard were removed from service completely decades ago, so they are genuinely all excess to requirements. We could transfer them. Well, therefore we could potentially transfer them to free, for free to Ukraine as an EDA, an excess defense articles grant. Whereas with PAC-2 or PAC-3, we'd have to do it via presidential drawdown authority. That would subtract from the overall established cap, which is finite. Whereas, any of these missiles that we have and are in working condition, we can just give them to the Ukrainians for free. As many as we have, really, that are in working order. Or if they're not in working order, as many as that we have the money for to refurb back into working condition. And then there's the logistical consideration. We have to figure out how to pay for logistical costs of transporting them. That's an issue for PDA as well. That's a bit of a whole different can of worms, though. But the fact that we have these missiles left in inventory is a very, very good from a long-term sustainment standpoint, because it really stretches out the time frame with which we can kind of confidently say that we can continue to supply Ukraine's interceptor needs for Patriot. So this is a very positive development.
Yeah, I think it's a good theory, John. It seems, like I can't think of a good reason why Russia would trot out a 30-year-old missile to make this point. So it, as you said, it really strongly indicates your theory. There's some weight to it.